And I want to welcome everybody, and thank you for coming. This is Gender Theory, Women's Liberation, and the Left. And I'm just going to read an opening statement. Feminist analysis is crucial for our understanding of male supremacist, racist capitalism as a whole. Yet women's liberation has too often been misunderstood and denigrated by many on the left. As Rosario Morales wrote in Feminist Revolution in the 1970s, it is time that we recognize the revolution cannot be won without women. What divides us is not the fight against sexism, it is sexism itself. On this panel, we're going to be examining current conflicts between radical feminists and much of the left, concerning a number of issues, including debates about gender theory that are important to the project of feminism. This is an emotional issue for many people, and we hope to start a calm and mutually respectful dialogue. It's important to keep in mind that the transgender rights movement, as well as the feminist movement, is not a monolith. There are a range of opinions. There are a number of transgender activists whom agree with gender-critical feminism in part or in whole. It's a shame that this debate has gotten so bitter. The gender-critical feminist view has been both censored and misrepresented, and this is not healthy for the left to shut down debate. There's a long history of women being interrupted. Feminists have a right to speak about disagreements without threats or intimidation of various sorts. Please wait until all speakers have finished. There will be time at the end to make brief statements and ask questions. Gender-critical feminists share with the transgender movement agreement that one's personality is not tied to one's anatomy. We fully support gender nonconformity. We fully support trans and gender nonconforming people's safety and civil rights. The right wing conflates sex and gender, saying, for example, that because one is born with a uterus, one must be submissive to men and long for motherhood. All feminists reject this position completely. However, many transgender activists conflate sex and gender also, saying that, for example, if one likes to wear dresses and makeup, that makes one a woman and not a man. Put into practice, this wipes out women's real concerns, issues based on our biology and on our material circumstances. Gender theory is largely postmodern, and the belief that gender is an inherent feeling that one is born with is anti-materialist. I'll quote Karl Marx, "It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness." So we will be hearing today the thoughts of some seasoned feminists and leftists on this panel. Our first speaker will be Kathy Sarachild. Kathy was a volunteer with SNCC in Mississippi in 1964 and 65, and active in the movement against the U.S. war on Vietnam. Her priority since 1967 has been organizing in the women's liberation movement. First with New York Radical Women, the group that pulled off the Miss America protest of 1968. And since then with the radical feminist group Red Stockings. She has also been working with a grassroots organization that Red Stockings helped to found, National Women's Liberation. Some of her writing and more information about her political work are on the website www.redstockings.org. So, Kathy.
Thank you, and hello everybody. I'm going to sit because I unfortunately I'm going to have to read my notes and I have trouble seeing, and I want to be closer. So excuse me. I got to. You're all very welcome here, and I sometimes think that this issue of gender and transgenderism is pulling together into a unity of different strands of the early feminist movement that hasn't existed in a while, actually. I mean, I'm thinking of, I feel a lot more in common with lesbian separatists than I used to, because we have the same views on the transgender movement and are both quite passionate about it. And I think probably some different on a left perspective are coming together also. So it's quite interesting what's happened, though it's also kind of terrifying what's happening to all our work with women's liberation. Red Stockings, the radical feminist group I've been part of for its nearly continuous existence since early 1969, in a Facebook post to entice people to this panel, asks the question, is the escalating replacement of the idea of, quote, women's oppression, unquote, by, quote, gender oppression, a new radical truth or an establishment-height liberal evasion of reality? The question suggests a little more than the title of this panel itself about the concerns that precipitated this panel. Steve, in his talk, is going to cover some of the political conditions we are now facing that made us think we needed to name and describe our panel in terms so abstract that few would know what it's about or be attracted to it. Aesopian language is one of the classic radical or left terms for this kind of language, and here we are at the left forum using it. Our Aesopian title for the panel has neither the term women's oppression nor gender oppression in it, but it does have women's liberation in it. And liberation, by definition, implies liberation from what? From oppression. So that even the term women's liberation implies its opposite, women's oppression, and that women are oppressed as a politically subject category, not by nature. Oppression, by definition, is a political category and can't be something happening in nature. It might take greater expertise than I have to know from the term, quote, gender theory, what it means. But it's clear that the practice of gender theory is real, because in many schools and universities across the country, the footholds for women's studies programs, hard-fought, won and named by the women's liberation movement, have now been replaced with new names. In some cases, the women's studies departments have been totally renamed to gender studies departments. In other cases, women's studies departments are now having to enlarge their names and undoubtedly stretch their resources to include gender studies, and more recently, also something called sexuality studies. The term gender theory is obviously a shorthand for something else, the something with the power backing to vie with the power of women's studies. Or some might argue, on the other hand, it's not the backing of the rich and powerful, the power of the donor class in the universities that's behind the gender studies victories, but the power of truth, the truth of the gender theory, overcoming the alleged wrongness of the theory of women's oppression which was the basic theory justifying the women's studies departments, departments for studying the theory of an age-old oppression of half the human race for the purpose of a freedom struggle. Pretty radical. No wonder it's being eliminated. I want to focus for the rest of my time on some thoughts on the relationship between women's liberation and the left. Because the relationship between women's liberation and the left is very important for both. If we look at the logic of what the left, with its origins in the French Revolution, has been historically, the theory of the left, in theory, the left represents the general movement of all freedom struggles, with women's liberation being one strand in the weave of the whole. In practice, though, women's oppressed condition has often been, and still often is, omitted from the general freedom movement struggles that the left is supposed to represent. Needless to say, however, this has not meant the death of the women's liberation organizing, because as the Chinese used to say, where there is oppression, there is always resistance. And women have fought and struggled and tried to enlarge their sphere of freedom and have never stopped trying in whatever way they can figure out to do. Sometimes it's even in opportunistic ways. In the 1960s era of renewed mass women's liberation organizing, we who were involved in public actions and writing to launch this term and concept, women's liberation, that inspired us, and a body of analysis and strategy to go with it, we nevertheless scoffed at the same time at what we saw as the stale and even patronizing old left term, the woman question. Many assumed that it was an old left term, because it was being kept alive by the circulation through the new women's liberation uprising of a book prominently titled The Woman Question, published by the U.S. Communist Party. I brought it. There it is. The Woman Question. It was the butt of jokes that I now see as ignorant, or else my own ignorance, or else miscomprehending of history, to the effect that the left, dominated by males, was portraying the oppression of women as just a question, whereas we new radical women were going to find and commit to the answer. It also didn't help that prominently displayed on the cover of the Woman Question book were exclusively the names of male communist revolutionaries, although inside there were a smidgen of female contributors. And we radical feminists, as we were soon calling ourselves, were adamant that women had to organize themselves into an independent power base, like a union, to achieve liberation. In the years since, I've realized that some of the pieces in this book, were actually what I would call very usefully radical feminist in content, despite these being written by the male revolutionary Lenin. But my main point here is that partly because of this book, I, and I believe others, had no idea that the phrase, the woman question, not only had a general left history, but also a feminist history, going back to a time when Karl Marx was only in knee pants, and along with similar terms like the labor question, the Negro question, the national question, the social question, was part of an international radical or left heritage that included the United States. In fact, the first use of the woman question that I have so far traced is in 1832 by the pioneering anti-slavery militant William Lloyd Garrison, in which he uses the phrase more than once in defending the right of women anti-slavery activists to speak and take part in the movement to end slavery. Not all the ranks of people of the left heritage, self-described radicals of all stripes, from Democrats to communists, agreed with feminists that women as an entire sex faced oppression. But many did. And Karl Marx and those associated with the valuable school of thought and action he pioneered were among them. Even though Marx himself, as well as others, had learning to do from women, those he inspired showed that they could make significant changes and advances. I can't take the time now for examples to illustrate the progress of Marxists on the woman question, from the time of Marx himself to the Bolshevik Revolution, for instance. But I'll just refer to a late 19th century essay by Karl Marx's daughter, Eleanor, a communist theoretician and organizer in her own right, and her lover, Edward Aveling, that you can now find and read online, by the way. The two called it, well, the woman question. It very much posits an answer to the woman question, and one which in many ways sounds like pure radical feminism. It names the condition that females face as not nature itself, but oppression, but quote, direct quote, but quote, oppression, and like the labor classes, merciless degradation, unquote. It names men as the oppressors of women when it comes to their condition as women, quote, an organized tyranny of men, unquote, and argues the need of a self-emancipatory movement by women. Quote, both the oppressed classes, women and the immediate producers, must understand that their emancipation will come from themselves. Women will find allies in the better sort of men, as the laborers are finding allies among the philosophers, artists, and poets. But the one has nothing to hope from man as a whole, and the other has nothing to hope from the middle class as a whole, end quote.
So our next speaker is Steve Bloom. He is the editor at Old and New Project, which is www.oldandnewproject.net. He's a New York City activist, a poet, and a composer, and he is a member of the Brooklyn Green Party and the Radical Poets Collective.
Thank you. I'm going to sit too, just because it feels more informal, like we're having a conversation. And I'm going to start with a few statements that may seem obvious to everybody, but bear with me because they'll provide a backdrop for what I want to talk about. And I have to change my first statement. My first statement was I didn't agree with everything said by our first speaker. But I'm going to have trouble saying that now because after listening to her, I can't identify too much that I didn't agree with. But just let's say I didn't agree with everything that the first speaker said because that, again, it sets the framework for what I want to talk about. I probably won't agree with everything that'll be said by all the speakers on this panel. I certainly don't agree with everything that's been said on all the panels I've been to at the Left Forum this weekend. And I don't expect all of you to agree with everything I have to say. It's all part for the course of a process on the left, of a discourse on the left. When we disagree with each other, this is the crucial question that I want to pose and try to give a certain answer to. When we disagree with each other on the left, which is all the time, what should we be doing? We have to listen, we have to dialogue, we try to consider, reconsider, find more complex ways to think about the questions that we're disagreeing about in order to resolve the contradictions that exist or appear to exist, or whatever formulation you want to use. Or else we'll agree to disagree and allow life and experience to resolve the outstanding issues for us over time, through the struggle, through our experiences. Today, however, we do have one group of activists on the left who have rejected that general approach, which I just outlined. Instead, they insist that others have to agree with everything they believe and say, or else they should be shut down and silenced. And I think it's obvious I'm talking about a vocal wing of the transgender movement. It's not clear to me how big it is, whether it's a majority, what its size, or any of that stuff, but it's vocal and it's influential. And it has a serious effect on left discourse, which would like to deny the right to speak to those radical feminists whose ideas they don't like. This is not a purely abstract threat. It's very real and concrete. Some of the issues have been documented in this ad that appeared in the last December's issue of the Progressive magazine. There were copies distributed, I think, on the tables. Everybody should have it. Titled Stop the Harassment and Threats Against Radical Feminists. I signed this ad. I helped solicit signatures for this ad and work with the folks who were putting it together to make it happen. And the website I co-edit, the Old and New Project, has put it up to make it available to activists to read, to see, to access, since on the Progressive website you have to be a subscriber to the Progressive to read their website, or to access, at least to access this on their website. I have little flyers about Old and New. If anybody's interested afterwards, you can come here and pick one up from me, but the goal here is not to promote that, just to let you know that it's available there if anybody would like to take a look. Personally, I have no problem with trans people expressing themselves and their gender preferences in any way they see fit. I'm going to repeat that because it's so important. I have no problem with trans people expressing themselves and their gender preferences in any way they see fit. I believe there is something wonderfully liberatory in this challenge to traditional gender norms, which has swept our culture. And it does have this very liberating aspect to it. But I also believe that there remains something essential in the specific struggle of women as an oppressed sex. That's the form of oppression which was most fundamental to the development of patriarchy back at the dawn of class society. It remains essential to the maintenance of patriarchy today in our culture. And it remains essential to the maintenance of capitalism and imperialism as a world system of domination. So the specific struggle of women as an oppressed sex can't disappear from our consciousness or our discourse. To the extent that there is a tension between these two things that I've just stated, which I believe are both true, and both of which I support, the right of trans women to express their own self-determination as women, and the traditional goals of the feminist movement, combating the oppression of women as an oppressed sex, The only way to resolve it is by engaging in a dialogue which aspires to affirm both sides of that reality. Finding an ideological and theoretical debate, discussion, combined with the experience of the struggle itself. It's the only method that can lead us to a genuinely liberatory solution to that problem. The left has in the past faced many difficult discussions, and this is hardly the first time that some have tried to establish the ideological dominance of one point of view by means other than the process that I've been describing, a process of intellectual debate and discussion combined with experience. The attempt to silence any opposition to a particular point of view has even gone so far in the history of the left, although hopefully this is something that we have overcome in the 21st century. But in the 20th century, it even went so far as physical violence and attempts to assassinate leftists that you didn't agree with.
More than attempts.
Such methods have always been a disaster, even when they stop short of actual assassination. And that's the most extreme expression, but it exists on a continuum. The suppression of one point of view in this way may succeed in establishing a political hegemony for a period of time for something you agree with, assuming you agree with the point of view that became hegemonic. But it can never establish the deeper understanding of the issues, of the questions of oppression, of the questions of liberation that we need if we really want to create the kind of movement we need for revolution. I'm going to cite one example. Consider how often, starting in the 1950s and then continuing even up through the last decade, a little bit today, but less today than it used to be, much less, left anti-Zionists were routinely denounced by others, including many others on the left, as anti-Semites. This accusation was made in an attempt to deplatform and silence the anti-Zionist viewpoint on the left, in order to avoid having to discuss the difficult issues about Israel, Zionism, Palestine, and Palestinian liberation. It was an effort to enforce one point of view, the pro-Zionist point of view, as the only possible point of view for everyone, whether on the right or on the left. But the real need was, and still is on that question, as on all questions, for a discussion, for a dialogue, for intellectual debate on the question of Israel and Palestine. To me, it seems that there's a clear parallel with the methods being used today by some in the transgender movement and that campaign to deplatform and delegitimize an anti-Zionist viewpoint on the left in the past. And the methods of attempting to silence any opposition are just as destructive today around questions of gender and feminism as they were when the attempt was to shut down the debate about Zionism on the left. I'm just going to cite one other example without going into any details, but those of you who are familiar with the 1950s and the witch hunt, the whole anti-communist witch hunt in the 1950s in the labor movement, which really was one of the primary things that destroyed the American labor movement as a fighting tool for the liberation of working people. So as I say, I'm not going to go into detail on that, and we could go back in history and find other examples of similar processes. They have always been destructive and never helpful. So my conclusion, I don't know where a real dialogue between the transgender movement and gender-critical radical feminists is going to lead us. I've had some ideas of my own. I've tried them out on people. They get shot down on both sides. Okay. But I do know this, that we have to have a dialogue in order to solve the problem. How to come up with how the real and apparent contradiction between these two viewpoints are going to be resolved in a way that respects everyone's right to self-determination. And that's the key. Everyone's right to self-determination has to be respected in this process. The only way to figure this out is through a process of political discussion, even if it's sometimes going to be difficult and unpleasant and stressful to have that discussion. We have to tolerate that level of stress in the movement, not through banishing one point of view from our discourse. So my practice, when I disagree with something that someone says in this workshop or any workshop, will be to listen to the people I disagree with, whether they speak from the platform or the audience, confront those I disagree with about issues that seem important and relevant to me, and ask them to respond to me in the same way. Seeking in this way a creative and non-antagonistic solution to our difficulties. It's the only way for the left to proceed on this or any other question. Thanks.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Kathy Scarborough. She's been active since the 1970s. She was a member of Red Stockings for a period in the early 1980s and became supportive of socialist and communist ideas through feminism. Currently, she co-edits Meeting Ground Online, meetinggroundonline.org, and is supportive of National Women's Liberation as well as Red Stockings. She participates in, a small local left group in New Jersey and has joined the Poor People's Campaign. She earned a PhD in reproductive endocrinology in 1990 and teaches anatomy and physiology at the college level. She understands gender down to the molecular level.
Thanks, and I'm so glad to see so many people here today. I'm going to address myself to some struggle with the left and with gender ideology a little bit more maybe directly or militantly, dare I say. And I want to start out by reminding us that a winning strategy for the left is this year's theme for the Left Forum. And yet, 50 years after the women's liberation movement burst on the scene, much of the left, as I witnessed last night at the plenary, is still claiming that economic class and capitalism is the primary enemy from which all oppression flows. We strongly object to the sidelining of females and black people as practicing identity politics, and our specific struggles being regarded as a diversion from the real struggle. Being black or female is objective reality, not something that can be identified away. When feminism, in addition, is uniformly smeared as a practice of identity politics, the diversity of the feminist movement is ignored, as is the historical fact that many of us were part of the radical 1960s WLM that denounced racism, capitalism, and imperialism in addition to male supremacy. Indeed, the charge of practicing identity politics is sometimes a way of covering up continued male supremacy on the left. One example is an article printed in Counterpunch just last year, and I want to give you a quote. The male author says, and I quote, "Mostly white males, especially on college campuses, led universalizing 1960s movements, but they marginalized women, people of color, and other oppressed groups, leading them to form their own identity movements." To this I say, huh? Can't this writer see the contradiction in claiming that the white male-led movement was universalizing while at the same time marginalizing women and black people? We're all for universalizing, but not within this framework. that mostly white males employ to maintain their domination of the left by dissing the two political and economic movements as merely cultural. Indeed, as we all agree, women are an indispensable part of the class struggle, and the left ignores the demand for the liberation of half the human population at all of our peril. Similarly, women's liberationists need a strong left to make progress in our battles, particularly in the effort to transform the relationship between work inside the home and labor outside those walls. Socialism alone is incapable of winning women's liberation simply because male supremacy, white supremacy, and capitalism, while certainly deeply interconnected, inflict oppressions having a good deal of independence from one another. As an example, the woman of color fighting for the $15 an hour minimum wage will get no relief from the racial and sexual harassment she faces daily when that economic objective is won. Even Hillary Clinton and Sheryl Sandberg are often debased sexually in spite of their ruling class status. They've been treated like cunts, just like all women are. Indeed, the impression of women is sometimes literally dehumanizing when we are treated as nothing more than commodities being bought and sold by human traffickers, pimps, porn kings, or when female bodies are used almost exclusively in a titillating way by advertisers to sell products. We know that identity politics sometimes is practiced, and when this is true, it should be criticized. A recent example that comes to mind was Hillary's argument that women should vote for her because she was a woman. Many on the left acted like they had no knowledge of feminists who opposed this opportunism. The left betrays the material basis of women's oppression when it dismisses all feminists as practicing identity politics, or when the left, as well as much of the feminist movement at this point, promotes a gender ideology that claims that anyone can self-identify as a woman. The material basis of women's oppression is our reproductive capacity and our work as the unpaid and underpaid laborers of the world. The unequal division of labor involved in reproducing the human race must be grappled with, and it must be recognized that this gives rise to some asymmetric demands critical to women's liberation. For example, we might press for some altered work rules during the third trimester of pregnancy and demand some kind of compensation for the socially important work of childbearing. What that compensation might look like is as yet undefined, but it's a political point here that childbearing is not just an individual or family issue, it's a collective issue. All societies require a reproductive rate high enough to replace aging workers. Other women's liberation demands have always included separating child rearing from childbearing. And surely mothers should not be penalized in hiring, promotion, seniority in the workplace, etc., as we are now. By promoting demands specific to the sexual division of labor, we are not elevating the class of female humans because of the social importance of childbearing. I am not fighting for my identity as a woman, nor am I running away from these aspects of the female experience. In this day and age, there is no reason childbearing should cause any further division of labor, and it certainly doesn't require a life of unpaid work supporting the labor power of other members of one's family, or the care of those too old to work or too young. Women will never be free if we don't get rid of this whole idea of women's work and begin to recognize that this work is something that benefits all society and thus must be shared as much as possible by all adults. Full women's liberation therefore requires a complete reorganization of the structure of labor outside the home. Of course, women's liberation is only one concern among many when contemplating restructuring the workplace. We feminists can make inroads, but radical feminists need a strong left movement to make real this vision of an equitable division of labor across society. Now, I wanted to turn now to a few more words about gender ideology. As others on the panel have said, it should go without saying, But in 2018, I know I have to preface these remarks by saying that we believe that transgender people deserve human rights and should not be oppressed because of how they live their lives. At the same time, we make the political argument that gender ideology denies sex and therefore undermines the material basis of women's liberation. Although the oppression of women and transgender people both arise from the system of male supremacy, the interests of women and trans women are not exactly the same, and the fight is not the same. To radical feminists, gender is not much more than adherence to stereotypes that we want to destroy, whereas sex, of course, determines the continuation of the human race. Gender ideology says that one can perceive one's own sex separate from the material reality of one's body. It becomes necessary to deny that menstruation or ejaculation is evidence of one's sex. Some assert that gender is assigned at birth, rather than agreeing that the sex of a newborn child can simply be observed. A huge problem for feminists is the idea, promoted by gender ideology, that female brains and male brains are substantially different. This is an argument that, of course, has been used to keep women down since the time of Aristotle, if not before. Few dare to suggest that the brains of black people are somehow different than those of whites, but this was a common notion until the power of the black movement defeated it. It is puzzling, if not shocking, that those who claim a Marxist heritage and apply a materialist approach when discussing the working class can be so captured by anti-materialism when it comes to this issue, accepting feelings and identity rather than science. In many ways, gender is a continuation of the nature versus nurture debate. And historically, the left has always come down on the side of nurture being the most important determinant of human behavior. Transgender people need legal protections, but they need a new set of laws to protect their rights. Transgender rights should not piggyback on women's rights or be held above women's rights. This political point of view that I've just expressed is almost impossible to have printed in any high-profile left journal. Last year, Jacobin published a fairly ignorant and ahistorical article on radical feminism that was brimming over with anti-materialist gender ideology. We at Meeting Ground sent in a rebuttal, but it was rejected out of hand. Then Monthly Review Online, Monthly Review, republished the same article in its entirety, and they too rejected our rebuttal, saying they didn't want to take sides. Yeah, well, I'm glad you got it. Let's think about this. Monthly Review Online certainly took a side, and it wasn't the side of women's liberation that they took. As Steve has discussed, radical feminists all over the world are being no-platformed, not allowed to speak. So we're here today calling on the left in general to struggle harder with identity politics and gender ideology, and to learn to discern the difference between those opportuning off our movements or actively promoting women's oppression and those making a good faith political argument that impacts the direction of our movement. We call on for vigorous debate rather than censorship. Thanks.
I'm going to speak now, and I'll introduce myself. I guess I have to sit down since everybody else has. My name's Tamara Wyndham, and I'm a longtime radical feminist and anti-capitalist, and I've organized a number of feminist consciousness-raising groups and also some study groups on second-wave feminism using many of the original documents. I'm going to outline some basics in feminist theory and demonstrate how much of current transgender thought and political practice has been undermining feminist theory and projects. And I'm going to repeat some things that seem to need to be repeated, but it's important to acknowledge that the transgender movement has a variety of positions and that there are a number of transgender activists who agree either completely or in part with radical feminism. But I'm going to be focusing on where we disagree. Women, like people of color and workers, are exploited for our labor. Women, particularly for the unpaid labor of producing and raising children and in doing housework and other things. People who are exploited for labor are always discriminated against. However, not all groups who are discriminated against are exploited for labor. For example, gay men are discriminated against for being gay, but they're not exploited for labor as gays. They could be exploited for labor if they are also working class and or also a person of color. They are discriminated against as gay men because homosexuality challenges the gender role system. Transgender people and all gender nonconforming people, like gay men, are discriminated against, but they're not exploited as transgender for labor. We feminists argue that all issues of sexuality, sexual orientation, and gender are directly related to the exploitation of women's labor as by men as a class, and that the exploitation of women's labor is the primary issue, and that issues of sexual orientation and gender identity are entirely dependent upon the issue of women's labor. We say that gender roles are simply a tool of the oppressor, the class of men. Men and women are not equally oppressed by gender roles. Gender roles are used to keep women in their place. While men may not be fully developed in their human potential within their male gender role, they still have the position of power. This means that while trans women may take on new gender roles, they do not and they cannot take on the exploitation of labor that women experience in pregnancy and breastfeeding. This doesn't mean that trans people aren't mistreated. They are facing harassment, threats, and violence. They are treated as freaks, while the oppressive treatment of women is seen as normal. Women and transgender people both face male violence. This is something that feminists and transgender activists could work on together. Unfortunately, many transgender activists have been focusing their wrath against feminists, but there has not been one single instance of a feminist physically harming a trans person. Feminists support civil rights for trans people, no discrimination in housing or employment, safety, no harassment, threats, or violence against trans people, the right to dress however one wants, the right to live one's lifestyle. The transgender movement claims that gender is based on one's internal feelings and not on one's physical body. But no one has been able to define what this internal feeling is without referring to gender role stereotypes. That someone who wants to wear dresses and makeup is a woman, and someone who wants to cut their hair short and drive motorcycles is a man, and so forth. When gender and sex are conflated and defined as an internal feeling, this contradicts the feminist practice of recognizing that women are exploited for our childbearing capacities. This attempts to reduce our issues to the lack of a right to choose one's gender, as if this lack of choice in gender roles is what is oppressive. There are serious sex class differences in power that this ignores. Feminists are working on building a mass movement to overthrow male supremacy. In order to do this, we need to build class consciousness among women, awareness that we are oppressed and exploited as women, and that women need to unite and work together, that our problems as women are not individual, but need a collective solution. Instead, we have young women looking for a personal solution through changing their gender, so that they don't see their problems as women's problems. They have false consciousness, meaning that they don't realize they're oppressed as women and have false ideas about the nature of the society that we live in. I'm now going to list and briefly summarize some of the main feminist issues that transgender activists have undermined. I'm sorry I can't cover everything in my time limit. Language about women's health. There are voices in the current transgender movement seeking to redefine classic feminist issues as not being about women. They conflate sex and gender and say that the anatomy of our bodies is irrelevant. Therefore, abortion, menstruation, maternity, breastfeeding, and every other issue connected to women's bodies are no longer women's issues because trans men experience them and trans women do not. There's a push to change our language to such terms as pregnant people, chest feeders, menstruators, and uterus bearers. This erases women's experiences and makes it difficult to name and fight the male supremacist approach to pregnancy and birthing. It also hides the connections between different women's issues: abortion, child care, housework, equal pay, and many others. Women's sports. When trans women are allowed in women's sports, they have the advantage. In November of 2015, the International Olympics Committee changed its guidelines. Surgery is no longer required for any transgender person. Female-to-male transgender athletes are eligible to take part in men's competitions without restriction. More importantly, male to female transgender athletes need to demonstrate that their testosterone level has been below a certain cutoff point for at least 1 year before their first competition. The decision is based on the belief that trans women lose their strength advantage after 1 year of hormone therapy. However, the acceptable level of testosterone in trans women athletes is 10 times higher than that the average female produces. A female who increases her testosterone to this level is considered illegal doping. Nor does this take into account height, bone structure difference, and greater heart and lung capacity of trans women athletes. Women's safety and privacy. Trans people, by and large, are not rapists and have no interest in sexually assaulting or causing any kind of physical or emotional harm. Many trans women in particular believe that their physical safety and mental health could be endangered by men in men's locker rooms or bathrooms. I understand this, but I don't accept that the idea that no men will ever take advantage of there being a legitimized way to gain access to women's spaces. There are already numerous cases of this happening, men disguising themselves as women in order to enter bathrooms to spy on women or assault women. Children. It was a second wave feminist project to raise children free of gender roles, that any child could play with any toy and grow up to achieve their dreams. But now a boy who plays with dolls or a girl who plays with trucks, instead of saying to them, "You're fine just the way you are," more and more frequently, parents and professionals are saying, "Maybe you were born in the wrong body." This reinforces the gender roles that feminists have been fighting against for decades, and children are pushed onto a track of puberty blockers and eventually cross-sex hormones and surgery, which may cause a number of health problems. A decision that children are too young to understand the implications of. There are many more issues that feminists and transgender activists disagree on. We need to talk to each other and resolve these conflicts. Let's work together to overthrow male supremacy and build a world where everyone is free. So we're ready with the Skype or the Facebook. Our next speaker is Linda Bellows. She's a British radical feminist and gay rights activist of Black and Jewish heritage. She has committed her adult life to liberation politics. She was the first non-white lesbian to join the Spare Rib Feminist Collective in 1981. She has a long history with the Labour Party in the UK. She was elected to Lambeth Borough Council in London in 1985 and was its leader from 1986 to 88. She was the vice chair of the Black Sections campaign to select African, Caribbean, and Asian parliamentary and local candidates within the Labour Party. She originated Black History Month in the UK while chair of the London Strategic Policy Unit. Bellows now teaches employers and their staff to apply the Equality Act 2010, the Human Rights Act 1998, and other equality law. Of late, she and other feminists have had fallings out with the Labour Party over the issues of shortlist for women and revisions to the Gender Recognition Act currently being debated in the UK. So, welcome, Linda.
Thank you. Very difficult to follow what has been said, but I'll try. I agree with much of what has been said, but I pose to you a different idea, one in which we look at the notion of race with the notion of gender. It seems to me, and I came to this view about 15, 20 years ago, that there was actually no such thing as races. There's a human race. Men, usually capitalist men, constructed the divisions in society that justified the exploitation of African men and women in the process called enslavement. It's the backbone of capitalism. I considered the word race to be a descriptor of human differences, often based on skin colour. And I don't know when it was, in about 2006, that I suddenly thought, what if actually race is a man-made notion? And I have a similar reaction today when I hear usually trans women, argue in Britain. I'm not party to international discussions, but I have heard arguments made by trans women that frankly appall me. I am less, should we say, inclusive than many of your prior speakers. I think that gender is a man-made notion, just as I think that race is. Human beings divided and values applied to their differences. And as a woman, and by the way, and I hope my short hair is visible to you, I get called sir about 3 times per day. I was called sir when I was 8 months pregnant. Quite. My children now are in their 40s. My grandchildren, I've got a granddaughter of 23 and growing younger grandchildren. And my role as a woman is, it's not validated by having children, but it's very interesting when in public with my grandchildren they call me grandma, or my children call me mum, and people are looking around to see who is this person, and it's me. Even if I look like a traditional, I'm going to use the word dyke, a word I'm very proud of as a lesbian. Reality of gender is that it is a man-made notion. It's one that has ascribed power, opportunities, that have been reduced from women. We had to fight for the right, and in Britain, it is 100 years this year, 100 years since women, some women, only ruling class women, upper class women, were allowed to vote in elections. And I'm sure that in some states in the United States, the period was longer. 100 years is not very long in human history. And the fact that we could not even vote, and the universal suffrage came to women in 1928, and it must be said, of course, that lots of working class men were also denied the vote. There was a property, a premium put on the ability to vote. So if you own property of a certain value, then as a man you could vote or be excluded from voting, and many working class men, of course, were excluded. And I say this because I'm not solely concerned about women alone. I am concerned about all those human beings who do not enjoy equal access to the law, to status, to being human beings. And the argument, certainly in Britain, for trans women to be recognised as fully as women is it's an argument that I can and have supported until recent developments, in which those of us who claim to be women are being told that we're being, I can't quite remember the language, but that we're being oppressive by virtue of being critical about gender, that we're transphobic. I have to say that as a black woman, if I said that every white person who says something a bit iffy to me, about me, or to other people, and I start calling them racist, then what, it would be ludicrous. I and we are a little more sophisticated in our critique of power, who has power, who is using it. And for me to say that I am critical of a system of oppression that denied me and other women opportunities to not only to be paid, but even to work, to study. In my youth, women could not study, could not have a whole range of things that men could have by virtue of them being men. And I am not going to ignore that. It's more than a slight. It is oppression. And it is still happening across the world, that women are treated less favourably. I'm using the legal language of British law. Women, girls, are treated less favourably because of their being girls or women, including left to die. Still, it's happening in the world today. Women, girl babies are killed because they are female. That rape, that prostitution are, frankly, these are things that are done by men. Of course, not all men. I wouldn't wish to imply that I think that all men are rapists, but I have to say, and I'm sure that every woman in your room would agree, that when you are walking down the street at night, you don't know whether the man who is walking heavily behind you might not attack it. We do not know, and we have to take into account the possibility that rape may occur in order that we protect ourselves. Now, I'm seeking not to be melodramatic, but these are realities that impinge upon the lives of women and girls. And the new transgender politics, and where, by the way, has it come from? I have looked in vain to see a particular start, but it is very recent. I cannot understand how women feminists are being barred, and that includes me, from speaking by a movement that is so recent and so unsupported by, what can I say, by facts. These are, of course, they're emotional issues, and for many trans people, these are, very, very significant matters, and I don't wish to diminish them. But the new politics of trans, which, by the way, I'm finding many traditional trans men and women are identifying away from, and it's coming, I'm getting messages of support from trans people who've been trans and transitioned over many years, and who distance themselves from this new politics. I wonder whether the new politics is simply anti-woman. Behind all of the real, not just difficulties, confusions, feelings, emotions that many trans people are having. I'm sure that those are real, but are they justified in terms of making physical changes to their body? And some people are arguing, certainly in Britain, that there is no need to change your outward manifestations or take hormones, and I deplore the use of hormones because of the damage they do to bodies. But merely by saying one is a woman, access to women-only spaces is being provided by people who are, I think, dismissive of the majority of women. By women, I mean those of us who have the relevant hormones and chromosomes, and I don't wish to fetishize the differences between men and women. We have fought, many men, but even more women have fought for the notion of equality, and it is being undermined by reinforcing very human and male-dominated culture of oppression. I read Marx from age 13. I don't know how I managed to get through some of his texts, but what is very clear that he was talking about men only. His notion of women was not included in the ideas of equality. And we've all, I hope, moved away from those. We've come to include women as full human beings. We've come to include African Americans as full human beings. And of course, not all people in America, and the president seems to be one who doesn't quite get the notion of African people being full, equal human beings. But as societies, we have embraced the idea that disabled people, that lesbian and gay people, that women, that there's a whole range of us who, in the past, would have been what's the word? Marginalised, paid less, degraded. These things we fought against, and the trans movement, the new trans movement, is playing a significant role in rolling back those gains, at least for women. And I suspect that once it happens in relation to women, other rights can be and will be rolled back. I don't think I want to say very much more. I assume that you're going to have a discussion and contributions to your floor, and I think I want to leave it there. Thank you.
So now we're open to discussion and questions. And, Fran, do you want to ask you said you wanted to ask a question, or Linda?
Hello, Linda Bellows. This is Fran Luck. I would very much like to ask you to just describe a little bit of what's been happening in the UK vis-a-vis the shortlists and the kind of struggle there that women connected to the Labour Party have been waging.
Can I have the first, can you give me the first bit of your question again,
The
please?
first part of the question was, can you talk about the struggle around the shortlists, or quotas actually, of women standing in government, that is being waged in Britain, as well as other, how that's playing out?
What I observe is, I'm not very close to it. I am a member of the Labour Party, but some of the minutiae of its doings are of less interest to me. What I observe is some, I think, difficult people, I call them young men, who are claiming now to be women, who now wish to take the spaces that women have fought for to be represented. I still think we're still, as women, the majority of human beings in the world, and yet certainly in Britain, one looks at who's in Parliament, the numbers of women have increased significantly, but still less than the 51% that we are in our society. And we have women's sections created. I voted against the notion of women's section, by the way, and I was a proponent of black sections of the Labour Party, but I didn't like the idea of what I thought was tokenism. However, it is the constitution of the Labour Party, and I have tended to abide by the constitution, and therefore in favour. And when I saw earlier this year that some people who had been, one young person in particular, who had been brought up and, it seemed to me, privileged as a male, now claims to be a female and they have done, and it's not just in Parliament, but they do this in women's sections. There's women's sections in the Labour Party up and down the country, and some trans women, as what they call themselves, are putting themselves forward for office to be elected to seats that were created particularly, in fact, solely for the purposes of including, ensuring more women involved in the Labour Party. So you have a mechanism for women and some people who have been brought up as men now taking those places and reducing the opportunities for women to be representing their constituents.
Thank
I
you.
hope that's clear.
Yes, it is.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? Yeah.
Thank you very much for this presentation.
Can you speak up loud? Yeah.
Thank you all for this presentation. It's a subject that the left doesn't really. Is this loud enough?
Stand up and you'll be loud.
Why don't I bring this over to you and maybe
oration, but I helped start the New York City Anarchist Book Fair in 2007, and in 2016 I was kicked out by the group that I helped started because I dared to organize a panel on gender. So my punishment for even daring to question this ideology was to get kicked out of a group that I started. But many of us, including Linda, have paid a high price for just sticking to our principles. What I wanted to say is I heard a lot mentioned here about debate and dialogue and discussion, all of things that we all value here. But when one side is fundamentalist and unwilling to debate, like have a rational exchange, for example, the anti-choice type people who threaten abortion clinics with bombs and stuff. So you have this extremist faction of the trans ideology that continually threatens women with rape and death threats and all forms of intimidation and bullying and silencing and violent rhetoric, which I think is like hate speech, but it's directed at feminists who challenge this ideology or simply question it. And so I ask you, any ideology that says we cannot be questioned, we will not tolerate any form of dissent, is sort of fascistic or totalitarian. ISIS, Nazism, the church, there's many examples of political cults that will not tolerate any ideology. But does that belong in the left? And lastly, if we're going to defeat this problem, we have to really name what it is. It's a movement seeking to co-opt feminism, destroy women's legal protections and human rights, and it's essentially in some form in MRA or men's rights movement. And when you're using violent rhetoric and saying you're willing to punch and curb stomp and murder women who disagree with you, I would classify that as domestic terrorism. So let's start dealing with this problem as for what it really is. And you've all unfortunate that that's what this has come to in the so-called critical thinking left, but I think I want to end with saying there's been an extreme failure of critical thinking in the left and the acceptance of this ideology. And if anyone wants to talk to me about this afterward, please do.
Do you want to answer her?
No, it's not so much an answer as just a response. The layer that you talk about is real, and the problem is real. But to me, the bigger problem is that this layer, which is dedicated to, a totalitarian ideology, or however you want to characterize it, dominates a discourse which includes a lot of other people. And we are not going to reach all those other people by lumping everybody into the most extreme fashion. No, I'm not debating. I'm not saying I'm contradicting you. Whatever it is, we're having a process of clarification. So, to me, the key people we have to address are the folks who repeat this stuff thoughtlessly just because they haven't thought about it. And so to start that thought process and address that layer, that's who I'm talking about when I say we need dialogue, debate, discussion. And we can have, I think, dialogue, debate, and discussion with a lot of people. Yeah, with a lot of people who are just repeating ideas that they hear without thinking about them.
Yeah, I had very much the same thought. In this environment, I don't see the extremists who are ready to stomp on women and shoot us and whatever. Although I know they exist. I mean, that terrible
Shoot threats against the left forum to beat them for just allowing panels like this online. So they're out there.
Yeah, I'm concerned about the online versus the in real organizing.
People have been physically attacked in person too, so it's
Yeah, but again, not in this environment. So I, like what Steve was saying, I'm more concerned about, or in this environment, I am more concerned about left groups that are accepting this ideology without thinking about it thoroughly. And that's why we wanted to do this panel, because we want to talk about this ideology, we want people to critically analyze it. I mean, I know that San Francisco, I punched a turf thing in the San Francisco Public Library.
The left group that has been using this thoughtlessly gave up this, took up this.
Well,
I don't understand.
What did you say? Just so I get your voice.
Could you give an example of a left group that has thoughtlessly parroted this ideology?
Well, I gave the example of the monthly review in my talk.
Can you explain that a little more? Because I didn't read the article. It wasn't clear what was behind it.
I could give you the link to the article, and I could send you our rebuttal. But anyway, Monthly Review repeated this gender ideology article and would not accept a rebuttal, a radical feminist rebuttal of the article. So that's one. Jacobin, forget it. I mean, Jacobin is just, they won't accept anything from. feminists, it seems. And I hate to say it because there's some people here, but I believe the group that I actually do support, National Women's Liberation, has a gender squishy view, which I want people to think more critically about.
One group,
Even in New York here. I just want to document this.
Okay. Am I being filmed, by the way?
Oh, if you don't want to be, turn it off.
If you don't mind. Yeah, I just want to kind of get that out, ask for others. No, that's okay. This is fine. One group that I find, mothers were brought into this and are being childbearing and uncompensated. And I think as a mother that's directly affected by this issue, I think it's important to bring to light what's happening in the schools nationally and even very locally here. Some of the most progressive schools on the left have bought the ideology whole stock. And while there are schools that are willing to listen to the parents about their concerns about social transition leading to medical transition, there are many who are not. Public schools in particular have been, I don't know if the word is legislated or required by de Blasio in New York City, that let the children, as young, way down to the youngest age, self-determine whether, they're going to at least socially transition. And it's of deep, deep concern to parents, the usurpation of this movement of parental authority and values.
I'm not going to answer it. I'm sort of raising a question. As I see it, there are two things going on. One is I know for a fact that I have argued with women's liberationists who have said things like they actually prefer trans men to ordinary men. This sounds like so I think there are some people who actually believe this stuff. But there are the other people, I think, and I think it's the larger problem, really, because I've always argued with women over 50 years about men's liberation. I think this thing about, the gender thing is really sort of the old men's liberation argument that men are oppressed by gender equally with women. But the new thing is, and I don't even think it's so much the outright censorship. I mean, we really were afraid to express ourselves to hold this panel. And I think the left is afraid. I wouldn't be surprised if Monthly Review is afraid that they don't really, do they really agree with this gender stuff? Are they afraid their funding will disappear? And with Red Stockings and National Women's Liberation, but it doesn't seem to be, I don't know what it is with National Women's Liberation, because even they have on their website that they have now invited, and I'm a founder of this group, really. Women's Liberation used to have a principle that we are female only. And that was based on a strategy that women had to be self-determining and that we needed a separate power base to really change men. There's a whole strategy about it. That strategy could always be questioned. And I've taken the position that rather than having trans women come into a group, I would rather that we open to all men. Why privilege trans men? But my point is that I really suspect that even people in feminist groups are afraid that if they are known to be associated with a trans-critical feminist group, they won't get jobs. They won't be funded. The power of the NGOs, the power, the donor class, and great term I picked up from Counterpunch. Oh, pardon? Whatever, but it's not just him, it's all these foundations that are big jobs opportunities for young people. That's all there is these days, practically.
Can I
Yeah.
get back to the...
Anyway, so how much is it, these funding mechanisms, how much is it that people genuinely disagree?
I wanted to comment that I also have two children, one boy, one girl, and they were both gender bullied as 3-year-olds, 3 to 5-year-olds, because they were gender non-conforming. And this was before the trans movement hit and who were the enforcers? It was the 3-year-old white boys. You have to act this way. 3-year-old white boys have got the message, and they are imposing it on everybody else. But I think today the issue, the bathroom issue, and the support for this transing of kids, which is very serious, I think maybe our approach should be to go back to the old idea of unisex bathrooms. Why are we differentiating at all, especially with little kids? Who cares? Why don't they just go to any old bathroom? Why aren't all bathrooms open to all children? One of the things my daughter got into trouble with as a kindergartner, she was telling everybody she was a boy because she had short hair. Everybody thought she was a boy anyway. She liked to play with the boys' things, so she would say, yeah, I'm a boy. And then she went into the girls' bathroom because she knew she was a girl. She went into the girls' bathroom as a kindergartner, and all these kids, there's a boy in the girls' bathroom! I mean, it's ridiculous, the things that we do, imposing this, as Linda was saying, this gender superstructure on a fairly trivial, at this age, at the age of small children, a trivial biological difference.
Let's see, you have your hand
on this. Usually this is presented as a bathroom issue, but it also extends to shower rooms. It extends to locker rooms and it's not just for children. It's for it's aimed especially at adults, and we have to face a certain fact that not just like in groups like and individuals have come to a left forum, for example, but in the broader political structure, when North Carolina said that the trans people had to use the bathroom that corresponded to what's on their birth certificate, that was a very isolated position, considered so far to the right that it was totally outrageous. And we have Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio, who are not left forum attending types, let's say. They proclaimed the boycott of all goods from North Carolina. And everybody in the country went along with it except for a handful of what used to be spoken for by the George Wallaces and the Lester Maddoxes and the ultra-segregationists. So we're dealing with and I'm glad that you mentioned about the NGOs and the funding and everything else, because something like this, as a worldwide phenomenon, which does not spring spontaneously from the masses or even the bulk of the transgender people, is an orchestrated worldwide event. And this is not just like people who feel this way and have a certain opinion. It's people that are making the laws. Like in New Jersey, they just passed a law that you can go back and change the gender or sex on your birth certificate. Do you know that? If you live in New Jersey, you can do that now. And there's a law under consideration in the New York legislature for the same thing. And I know that I just want to mention that I've heard that in the British schools, children in kindergarten are being made to identify whether they're girls or boys independently of their anatomy, and that becomes a factor in tracking them for the rest of their lives. And
That's enough, thank you. Do we have some more?
So I kind of want to ask the question. Like we said that gender non-conforming individuals should be supported, but I'm thinking specifically of men who present in a feminine way. Where do we draw the line between, appropriate presentation and something that is more fetishistic?
I've thought about that, and I think that I've thought about that. And I don't know that we'll ever come to a consensus on it. I mean, there are men who wear dresses and skirts and aren't trying to pass as women, and then there are ones that attempt to pass, and then there are some that go overboard with really sexualizing and fetishizing in a way that could be very pornographic and insulting to women. And I have a feeling, even in Facebook groups, we've talked about this, and somebody posted a picture of a man, and then we all started arguing over whether this was fetishistic or not. He was someone kind of in the borderline area, and we were all arguing, so I don't know that. I mean, I think it's something that we can discuss and criticize, but I don't know that we can ever come up with hard, fast rules, but maybe discuss it in a way where we have more of a general awareness. That's my opinion.
Who's next?
Well, you've been raising your hand.
Yes, I want to just.
I do want to thank you all very much for having the courage to have this panel. I do feel that it would have been stronger if the trans inclusionary position were represented on the panel. I don't know if that's something you tried to do and nobody wanted to speak, which is certainly something I've experienced. I want to offer some other perspectives and a question. I agree with much of what you've said, but I also think that that anyone who's a feminist, and certainly a radical feminist, needs to be very cautious around things that smack of biological determinism of what it means to be a woman. So are those of us who have never been pregnant or breastfed not somehow subject to exploitation as women? Do we want to be going in a direction that said, it seems to me that what we want is to say that biology is not determinative, that gender is fluid. My feeling is, why do you have to change your body? Why do people have to change their bodies? And I have never felt comfortable with the idea that someone can be in the wrong body. Having many friends who are disabled, who grew up being told that there was something wrong with their bodies, having had many friends who, spent years trying to have a different body size or shape or a different nose or something. My thing is body positivity, but not body determinism. So I feel like, where does that fit in? I also want to say that when you say, well, we support trans people having human rights, but we don't support their right to define themselves or to declare their own identity. I remember when I came out, or when I came into the movement in San Francisco in the 1980s, the Revolutionary Communist Party's position at that time, and for a very long time after that, was that we support civil rights for gay people, but we think homosexuality is a product of bourgeois decadence, and after the revolution, they'll be re-educated. We refuse to work with them. So I feel like the position that you're staking out sounds a little suspicious. And the last thing I want to say is, there was actually a thing at the Anarchist Book Fair this year where some women wanted to have a 1-hour women's health workshop on guerrilla women's health movements. San Francisco. And they specified that this workshop was open to everyone. Everyone was welcome, but it was going to focus on bodies with cervixes and breasts. And for that, they were trashed viciously online. The book fair ended up issuing an apology to the trans community. The organizers issued an apology. They pulled the workshop. So because they wanted to have 1 hour where they weren't talking about a lot of different forms of women's health care. Well, and where they didn't want to have, they weren't talking about menopause, they weren't talking about diabetes, they weren't talking about celiac disease, they were talking about a very limited range of women's health, but important movements. This workshop had to be canceled. So I feel like this is a huge problem. This is an example of the left sort of going with trans orthodoxy in a way that silences women and that disappears women. I think this is a big problem. But, I mean, when you start talking about anarchists working with the FBI to classify people as hate groups or, parental authority, I mean, are radical feminists really promoting parental authority? Is that the position that we want to be taking? So my question is actually, and the other thing I want to say to your point about Zionists, I don't think it's a great analogy because at this point I would hope that Left Forum would not actually have Zionists, would not host Zionists. So it's just not really true that all perspectives are welcome or should be welcome in the left. So my question now is, can there actually be self-determination for both radical feminists who don't want to share space with trans women and for trans folks?
I hope someone responds to the biological determinism argument.
You want to respond?
Well, I was just going to say earlier that when you're talking about children, that children's brains don't even fully develop until they're adults, in their early 20s. Mm-hmm. At least you and I have critical thinking to some degree where we can reject ideas that we don't like or don't make sense to us, but children don't necessarily have that. And so what's going on now is child abuse to project these ideologies onto these tiny bodies and undeveloped minds. And basically mind fuck these children and don't even give them a chance to develop in their bodies and ideas and personalities and tendencies freely, and instead of projecting these ideologies. So that's I would be, I'm not a parent, but if I was, extremely concerned about that. And about this biological determinism, I think that's a false framing. No one's saying you are the sum of your parts. You're a human being. You're a unique human being, just like your unique fingerprint. And you should develop that uniqueness in every way you can as a male or female or whatever. But to say that females, like black people who have to think about their skin color and how that could get them killed maybe in a white supremacist society, female-bodied individuals under patriarchy are subject to the abuses associated with that body, a female body. That's why they're dying on a daily basis from botched abortions around the world, not because of their identity issues, but because of their material physical condition. So that's not biological determinism. That's called a physical scientific fact of nature, whatever. That's female is already pretty well defined. If you need a dictionary to figure that out, but there's already an existing definition. So the question is, why is it being redefined for someone else's political agenda that is in many ways anti-feminist? And yes, we are all doing this in a climate of fear and intimidation and bullying, whereas panels like this aren't allowed to happen for the most part. So yeah. But those are some of the issues that I would like to, this term exclusionary is very misleading. How can you exclude something that didn't belong in the first place?
I wanted to say, if a woman, I was talking about a system in male supremacy that seeks to control women's fertility and exploit us for our ability to bear children and nurse children and then care for children. And that doesn't mean that a woman that chooses not to have children or that a woman who is unable to have children is not a woman. And it certainly doesn't mean that she doesn't end up being exploited or discriminated against as a woman. And That has always been the case for feminism. That's like this weird argument that some trans people have come up with that I'm like, what? Where did that come from? Does anybody else want to answer some of those? Oh, yeah, Linda, do you want to respond to any of these? Or can she hear us?
Is she on?
Yeah.
Kat, is she on?
Yeah, she's on. You hear us, Linda?
Are you talking to me?
Yes.
Oh, are you able to hear the questions?
No, I didn't hear the question.
Oh, well, it's kind of a long, complicated question. But the other question you raised was, you made the comparison with it was the RCPs, and their treatment of lesbian and gay people, and that is. I can see that. I believe this is a bit different, and part of the reason is that like a lot of children who are gender non-conforming, when they're maybe 3 years old or 5 or maybe teenagers. The studies have shown that many of these children, like they think they're trans or they're told that they're trans, and if they're left alone, they usually resolve their body dysphoria and they usually end up lesbian or gay. And there's this real anti-gay and anti-lesbian current in some transgender interpretations, like that. Yeah, and I think that this is a really different sort of thing, and it also has to do with completely redefining what a man or a woman is, where the lesbian and gay issues never did that. I think that the trans issue is really a very different issue because of these things. Yeah.
I'd like to call for research on the history of this right-wing, totalitarian, violent trans ideology. I think there are a number of organizations who've done research on the rise of various fascist organizations. There's a book, Fear, Inc., that summarizes the research on the rise of Islamophobia. So if we don't have that information, I think it's really important that we do some research. I have some theories. We can talk about the role of the pharmaceutical industry in this. But it's a question. Where does it come from? We can talk about the role of various intelligence agencies that want generally to smash all progressive ideologies. So I think we need to find out about the funding, and we need to find out about the institutions that have been promoting ideas that are, that I think there's been a hugely clarifying. I really want to thank everybody who presented. There's been a very clarifying workshop on the differences between radical feminist and gender-based analyses. So I thank you and ask for more work.
Let me just follow up a little bit on that. I have read something. I agree with you. We need more work, and I'm not going to be able to fill that in. But I have read some things from the lesbian gay community talking about how that T got attached to LGB very quickly and kind of kind of came up from below, and nobody knew where it came from, and then all of a sudden the T was there. which is interesting. I wish I could. I'll have to try to dig back and find those articles when people were talking about where did this tea come from. This was a few years back that I read this.
I was involved in some of that in London. Can I tell you what happened?
Yes, please.
Well, after the murder of Stephen Lawrence, the Metropolitan Police in London got together a group of community representatives. They had done it on the issue of race, or the words I can't bear, but anyway, they'd done it on this issue. And then after a man called David Copeland had murdered some gay people, the idea of having a community group advising the police was proposed. I came forward and I was elected after some time, elected the chair of this group. I was quite hostile to including trans, but I was persuaded, and I think I was right at the time, that because some trans women had been murdered, in fact they were murdered by their partners, so this was as it were, internal matter, not a kind of community matter, but then there was no place for trans to be, and so we included LGBT. So this is 1999 that we started these things, and I must say that I was supportive of the continued involvement of trans people in the group because there were so few of them out, and they had a vulnerability, and my view, and I think that of other lesbian and gay and bisexual people, actually no, there weren't many bisexuals who were out, who were able to be out, but for lesbian and gay men and women, we did recognise that trans had no place. There were so few of them publicly that they'd better come in with us. What has happened recently has been a huge growth of transgender politics, and it seems to me very different to the politics that I had experienced in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. But trans got involved, got into the LGBT. And some of us in London and in England are talking about we move ourselves out. And I'm talking about particularly lesbians. What gay men choose to do will be their business. But lots of us as lesbians are actually not wanting to be in the group LGBT. We want lesbians because we have particular issues that we wish to deal with, that only those of us who are, I can say, anatomically and socially women should be talking with each other and making demands on the state for matters that might reduce the hostility and the violence that we experience. So that's my version. There may be other stories, but I can tell you that back in the day, we did include trans because there was nowhere else for them to go. Now I think numbers are such that there's every reason why trans should be and could be a group on their own.
I have some experience and opinion on this myself in New York City, that we used to have a women's liberation center in New York, and we had a lot of cultural feminist groups and women's groups and institutions. And it was during the AIDS crisis that when so many gay men were dying, and lesbians, were compassionate, of course, and wanted to help them, and a lot of support for women-only space was lost when lesbians started to focus more on working with gay men instead of having something independent. And we lost the Women's Liberation Center that was replaced by Lesbian and Gay Center. And then a few years later, the bisexual community formed an alliance with the transgender community to change it to LGBT. And I, as part of the bisexual community, I had the minority voice that nobody listened to, unfortunately, that I was not interested in an LGBT. I was interested in bisexual, lesbian, and heterosexual women working together on a women's movement. And I wished I'd had more support for that.
Can I raise one more
Yeah.
issue about the tea, the history of the tea being included? I don't know how many people are aware of Jennifer Pritzker, a billionaire who has funded a huge NGO that promotes transgender everything, everywhere. So there's a lot of money. There are a few billionaires who are big into promoting the transgender agenda. Pritzker. Jennifer is a trans woman. And the trans woman who's like a colonel in the army or something.
That means a male, an ex-wife.
Yes,
right?
yes. This person was a male for most of life and became a woman, I believe, around the age 50 or so. And has really been puts a lot of money into.
His whole family has this big pharma. John Stryker is another one with the Arcus Foundation, George Soros.
Well, there are a lot of billionaires.
A lot of billionaires. Martine Rosenblatt.
There's a lot of overlap between them and the transhumanists, too.
Yeah.
Like, they're obsessed with separating the body from their consciousness and all sorts of weird, shady things that they're pouring money into.
Well, we're running out of time. I want to thank everybody. You want to say one more thing?
1 minute quick final thing. In response to the question, which I think is the right question that was raised in the back, can there be self-determination for both elements in this equation? That's the question. It's an open question. I think we have to start from the expectation that that's what we're aiming for, that's what we're trying to find. Let us prove in the process that we can't, and then we'll have to figure out how to deal with it. But let's at least start from the point of view that we're...
But the thing is, we're not starting, we're in the middle.
Well, all right.
Yeah.
In some ways we're in the middle,
We're
in some ways
fighting,
we're
we're
at the
fighting
start.
back against a usurpation of the woman.
And what about affirmative action?
Further, whether online or in person, we're based in New York, but we can, talk online. Please come and sign your email here. I think it's an important discussion, and I hate for it to end right now.
So if you want to, you can tell Left Forum that this was a great panel and you want to go right Thanks to our panelists and thanks to Linda.
Thank you,
Thank
Linda.
you
so much. Thank you for
Can I
organizing.
please get the name of that article in the Jacobin? Oh, yeah, sure. It's here. And I want to make sure did you write it here? I want to make sure that that woman doesn't leave. Oh, you have it right here? Yeah. Did she leave? I want to get her email list. I think I'm going to